I'm very, very pleased to be here. Professor Luckhurst suggested I say a few words to begin with about my career as a journalist. So I was born in Glasgow and brought up for the first few years of my life in Clydebank. We lived in a council house in Clydebank with my mum and dad and my grandmother and two aunties. By the time I was about 5, we moved to Edinburgh, and I won a scholarship to what was then called a grant-maintained school, and it's now a private school, fee-paying school. And I say that because as journalists you will quite often define people within a word or a sentence. So you could define me, if you chose, as having come from the privileged background of going to a fee-paying school, or you could define me as coming from the non-privileged background of coming from Clydebank, which is an area, if you live in Glasgow, which is known as one of the rougher parts of Glasgow, which is saying something sometimes. From Edinburgh I was going to be a doctor, and I decided at the last moment I wanted to be a writer and a journalist, and I decided I didn't want to go to Edinburgh Medical School. So instead, at the last minute, I thought, where can I go where I can read for an English degree, where I don't have to do Chaucer? And the answer, of course, was Kent. Canterbury. The English degree then, you could avoid Chaucer and Middle English, which is exactly what I wanted to do. So I did a degree in English and American literature. I was mostly interested in the literature of the last 200 years. And that, I suppose, is a theme throughout my life. So that, for example, when I see yet another drama on British television which involves men on horseback with swords and women with bonnets, I die inwardly inside. Because I think there are a lot more interesting things going on in the world right now. And one of the reasons why American television is more interesting in many ways than British television is they get that. And sometimes British television doesn't, because we're ruled by nostalgia. Anyway, I did a degree there in English and American literature, and then I went to Leeds, where I was a postgraduate in Irish literature. And eventually, having applied a couple of times to the BBC and been ignored, I got a job with Thomson Newspapers, which at the time owned the Times, the Sunday Times, and a number of regional and local newspapers. And they offered me a job on The Scotsman, which I turned down because I could think of nothing I wanted less than going back to Edinburgh, having just finally escaped. And I said, I don't suppose you've got any jobs in Belfast? And surprisingly, they said to me, do you know, nobody ever asks us that. Yes, we do. We have plenty of jobs in Belfast. Would you like to go there? And that's where I began my journalistic career in the mid-70s. It was the best decision I've ever made in terms of career, because that was where the news is. And one of my great heroes in terms of how to answer a question, at least, is a guy called Willie Sutton. Willie Sutton was a bank robber in the United States, and he was once asked when the FBI caught him, why do you rob banks? And he said, because that's where the money is. I went to Belfast because that's where the news was, and I think that is not a bad way to approach our common career. After that, I was picked up by Newsnight because I did a story about a guy called Giuseppe Conlon, who was basically fitted up by British police for being an IRA bomber, and he wasn't, and we managed to get him pardoned. Unfortunately, he died in prison before he was pardoned. But Newsnight offered me a job. I worked for them for a bit, worked for BBC News, went to the United States and became the North America editor of the BBC, and then came back and presented on Newsnight and other news programs. So that's what I do, and that's what I still do. But what I thought I might talk about today is the art of storytelling, and not the stories that you tell as individuals, but the stories that you are being told and being fed by people in power. I've written a few books, a few novels, and most recently a book called Lessons from the Top, which is how leaders that I have met tell stories to the rest of us to make us want to follow them. So it's based on people like Angela Merkel and Bill Clinton and Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair, President Zardari of Pakistan, one or two others, Thabo Mbeki and so on. And they are all storytellers. I mean, we are all storytellers, but we're storytellers as journalists. You're also storytellers as individuals. You told a story to get in here. It was called a personal statement. You will tell a story if you want a bank loan. What struck me is that the leaders in our society just do it in a more organised fashion. And I wrote the book partly to see what we can learn from them, and partly to see through them, to see through some of these techniques. And I suppose my kick-off point was Alistair Campbell. Because a few years ago, I had to introduce him at it was a very, very big public meeting. And it was after the Gulf War, and he was, let's put it this way, not trusted by everybody in the room. And before I introduced him, he said to me, "What are you going to say about me?" And I said, "I'm going to say you're Alistair Campbell, you're Tony Blair's former press spokesman, director of communications." He said, "That's fine." He then got on the platform and said he liked my introduction much better than the introduction that he'd received the previous week in Leeds, when he'd been introduced as, "Please will you welcome Alistair Campbell, the most evil man in Britain." And I thought, wonder why he said that. That's an interesting way to begin a discussion. And of course, by the end, he's a very bright guy, he's a very charming guy. By the end of his hour with the audience, they were eating out of his hand. He told a number of self-deprecating stories about who he was. And I started to think about other communicators, smart communicators, the people that you will deal with. And it struck me that they all tell three basic stories. And they're all the same three basic stories. The stories they tell are, who am I as a person? Who are we as a group? And then finally, if you're still listening, where's my leadership going to take us? And I don't think you buy into the third part until you bought into the other two. And so as I began the research for the book, I started to think about some of those leaders that I'd met. Mrs. Thatcher. Who am I? I'm just a grocer's daughter from Grantham. What a brilliant 5-word story. Over and over and over, she told the same story. You could tell all sorts of stories about Mrs. Thatcher. But the one she chose to tell about herself was, I'm a grocer's daughter, I'm not that posh. I'm a daughter, not a son. And I'm from Grantham, I'm not one of the metropolitan elite. Very clever story. Bill Clinton, the first time I met him, well actually I bumped into him. It was, he was out running in New Hampshire. He was still governor of Arkansas and hadn't declared he was running for the presidency. And I literally bumped into him. I was in a hotel lobby. And there was this very big, very sweaty man in blue lycra tight running pants. It was a scene I'll never forget, to be honest. But we got talking. And after about 20 minutes, he's a very gregarious, very interesting person. But he kept saying to me, well, you know, because I kept asking him, are you running for the presidency? And he kept talking about his, basically, what he called a middle class background. Middle class is slightly defined differently in the United States. It almost means anybody with a job. And he said, I'm just the boy from Hope. Hope, Arkansas was the town that he was born and brought up in. And it was several years later when I started to check, when I discovered actually he was largely brought up in Hot Springs, Arkansas, which is a gambling town. But that's not the story he chose to tell because it wasn't so. It didn't translate in the same way. So the who am I story is absolutely vital because that is the point at which somebody, a leader, is trying to make contact with their audience and define themselves. And if you don't define yourself adequately, as perhaps Ed Miliband is finding now, other people will tell the who am I story for you. He's a bit weird. I don't think he is a bit weird personally, but that's the story which some people are trying to use to define them. The who are we story, well, that's kind of obvious too. To take Labour, Miliband is saying, we're not old Labour, we're not new Labour, we're one nation Labour. There's a kind of who are we story. Conservatives, you may have heard in the past, have told a story which goes, we're compassionate conservatives. And I was actually there when that phrase was minted, which was in 2000 in Philadelphia, when George W. Bush was running for the presidency of the United States. And at the Philadelphia convention, he announced he was a compassionate conservative. Not a phrase that he came up with, but a very bright woman who worked with him called Karen Hughes came up with it. And I remember standing in the audience next to an old friend of mine who was a Republican. I said, compassionate conservative, that doesn't mean anything to me. What does it mean to you? He said, well, it means anything we were in the past that you don't like, we're not that anymore. And anything we were in the past that you still like, we're still that. Who are we? And where my leadership's going to take us, that's the policy. That's the bit they want you to cover in the end. But if they haven't made the initial contact through explaining who they are, explaining who we are, which can be the political party, it can be a football supporters club or whatever, then you're not really going to be listening to the third part. And there are a number of other techniques that politicians have used and continue to use very successfully to try to persuade you that you should listen to them and take them seriously. And I'll just end with one further one, which I came across in the book through meeting another great leader called Dolly Parton. She actually runs a very successful business. She's one of the biggest employers in the state of Tennessee. She runs a business called Dollywood, which is a theme park in the mountains, the Appalachian Mountains. She also runs a charity where she makes sure that kids that otherwise wouldn't get any books, get books in their home. She's a good person. Apparently she also writes songs as well, who knew? I spent a day with her once at her home in Nashville, and we did an interview. But by far the most interesting thing to me was the extent to which she is a storyteller. There is a real person called Dolly Parton, and there's an act called Dolly Parton. And the bit that you see is the act called Dolly Parton. I said to her at one point, we were getting on very well, so I felt like I'd be quite cheeky. I said, I have to ask you, which bits of you are real and which bits are false? And she said, it's all false. She said, it takes a hell of a lot of money to look this cheap. And when I asked her if she'd ever considered running for political office, she said, well, there've been enough boobs in the White House without mine. Now, why did she do that? Why did she do that? Why did Alistair Campbell say he was the most evil man in Britain? They were confronting the worst that other people might already be thinking of him. Because as journalists, in fact, as individuals, we all have a pre-story. It may be a prejudice. If you met, I don't know, Nigel Farage walked in here, everybody in the room would have an idea about him. He'd have a cigarette in one hand and he'd have a pint in the other hand, and he'd be dressed in a particular way. And the same is true if Frank Lampard walked into the room. You have a pre-story in your head. The question for political leaders and others is that going to be a good pre-story? And if it is, I'm going to reinforce it. And if it's a bad pre-story, how do I subvert it to make you nice, lovely journalists write the thing I want you to write? And you're much more likely to write the thing I want you to write about where my leadership is going to take us if I can sell you who am I and who are we. Thanks very much. I'm happy to take questions. Yeah.
Is being Chancellor what you thought it would be?
Well, it's a lot of dressing up. Kind of. I mean, I tell you what I'm most surprised about, which is how tiring shaking hands is. There's a lot of that, and there's a lot of you. And what I do think, though, is that for every single person who gets a degree or an award from this university or any other university, that day, that moment is incredibly important, because I remember exactly what it was like when I got my first degree. Excuse me. And so what I try to do, at least, is make that day as important for each and every person who is there as I possibly can. But broadly, yes, it is. The things that most surprise me are that the Chancellor's robes are incredibly heavy. I don't know what they put in it. I think they put lead in case I run away with it and steal it or something. That's the one thing. The other thing that I found quite interesting was I've talked to a lot of students on the point of graduation and asked them what they're doing next. Usually I say, what's next for you? And what I've discovered is students from the humanities tend to say, I'm doing a postgraduate degree, or I think I've got a job. I noticed that a lot of the business students say, I've got a job or I'm starting my own company, which is fantastic. I noticed a lot of the law students say, when I say what's next for you, they say, oh, I'm going to walk down here and pick up my degree certificate and sit down. And I just wondered if maybe lawyers take things a little bit literally. That's all I wondered. Yeah.
I'm from Canada, from Ontario, and I find BBC is obviously a wonderful company and wonderful news agency. I was curious though, with you being the North American chief correspondent, how did that all sort of come to be? I mean, I'm just asking because I'm kind of curious. What are the chances of someone from Canada being a correspondent for the BBC over in Canada or the US or North America?
I suspect it comes down more to money than anything else. Okay. There are certainly some Americans, I don't know if there's any Canadians. I mean, as you know, there's a lot of Canadians who broadcast for American TV. Lise Doucette is Canadian, yeah, that's true. And there's another one, I'm trying to think of her name. So it's not as if there's a bar to Canadians. Right. Although, you know, maybe we should think of it. No, that's not the point. I think the point is, the bigger point is a question of money and how far the Bureau in Washington and elsewhere you can actually get out and cover North America. In fact, when I was there, when Tim was there with me, we covered lots more than just the United States and Canada. I mean, I spent a long time in Central America and Peru, and I've been to Argentina, Brazil, and various other places. It was a very, very big beat, and quite exhausting, I think.
How do you think the press can make politics more accessible to normal people?
Well, I'm not sure it's a question of making it accessible, actually. I mean, I've just come back from, I delivered a lecture last week in Canterbury at university about trust. And I spent a great part of this year in Scotland. And what was interesting about the events in Scotland, well, just to take one example, on the island of Islay, where there are 8 whiskey distilleries and 3,000 people, which seems a great ratio to me anyway. On one night that I was there, 300 people turned up at a public meeting to discuss Scottish independence. That's 10% of the population, and given that many of the population would be children, that's a heck of a lot of adults who turned up. Now, that wasn't because the press did it. That was because people were genuinely engaged in something which would make a difference to their lives. Part of the problem, this is a long, long discussion. You know, while it would be lovely for the press to make politics more interesting, it's also up to politicians to make politics more interesting. And I'm beginning research on a new book on trust and why we don't trust the media, why we don't trust politicians, and so on. And one of the interesting things about how we look at politicians is we think, and you will have heard this all the time, we think they're all the same. Now, they're not all the same. And I know that leaders in the Conservative and Labour Party, for example, get very irritated by this. But there are reasons why people think they're all the same. And the core reason is they are fighting over about 3%, one way or another, of how much you tax and how much you spend. And we know that. So the choices between having, for instance, the past 4 years of a Labour government delivering austerity and having a Lib Dem Conservative coalition, there are differences. There are clearly differences. And there may be differences if there's a second term for the Conservatives or if Labour comes in. Of course there will be. But actually, at its core, the difference between the austerity that Alistair Darling was offering and the austerity that we've had over the past few years is not that huge. Whereas the SNP in Scotland, UKIP in Britain, Beppe Grillo in Italy, Podemos in Spain, Syriza in Greece, offer huge alternatives, very, very different ways of looking at the world, and they tend to engage people. 85% of people who could have voted in the Scottish referendum voted in the Scottish referendum. 37% of people who could have voted in the US midterms voted. It's not about the media coverage. It's not about media coverage. It's about, do the alternatives engage you? Do you trust that they will do what they say they're going to do? And the answer is no, we don't as a society. We do not trust. We don't trust tabloid journalists. We trust other journalists quite a bit, but we don't trust politicians at all. 9%. And that's the fundamental problem. And it's not that politicians don't get it. It's not that they're lazy or stupid. It's just that they find it very, very difficult to break out of a kind of straitjacket for the past 30 years, which says this is the way you have to proceed in order to manage an economy. And Scotland's very different, because they were offering, the nationalists were offering breaking away, and people were totally engaged. So we need something that will engage people, and politicians need to do that.
On your theme of storytelling, do you think we as journalists should be challenging those stories more than we do? I mean, if you take your Nigel Farage example, as journalists, quite happy to buy into that image while he was an outsider. But do you think there is enough done to challenge that, his version of himself?
I don't think there's enough done to challenge any major politician's version of themselves, to be frank with you. You know, politicians constantly say it's all about the policies, not about the personalities, and then try to sell their personalities. Unless they haven't got a personality, in which case, good idea to get one. We need to challenge it.
Mind on that.
Yeah, exactly. We need to challenge, and it's not just Nigel Farage. It's David Cameron. It's tell you who did it with David Cameron. I think it was the Mirror. Remember all the Hug a Husky stuff and the greenest party ever, and I'm cycling to the Commons, and then I think it was the Mirror photographed the car behind carrying the clothes. So that was saving a lot on greenhouse gas emissions. I just think every politician should be challenged on the story they try to tell us about who they are, not just where their leadership's going to take us. And I think Miliband should be up for it as well. He is challenged in a different way. And I'm not saying this is done better in America, but I am saying it's done more ruthlessly in America. For example, and you could say that's because of the relative weakness of the political parties, because individuals raise money for themselves in order to get elected. But look at the way Obama has been challenged over the past six years. He has, of course, been challenged on his healthcare program, which is fine, and his foreign policy, or lack of one, that's fine. He's also been challenged on who he is. He's not an American. He's not a Christian, he's a Muslim. And he has had to rebut those charges. He has had to redefine who he is. And he's done it in a very clever way. For example, I don't know if you remember, but he made public his birth certificate, proving that he was born in Hawaii. Therefore, he's an American. Therefore, he can be the president of the United States. But in the same week, he appeared before the White House Correspondents Association dinner, which is a very good fun event in Washington. It's black tie dinner. The president usually turns up and says something funny. The White House Correspondents' dinner that year, it was 2 years ago, I think, 3 years ago, he said, look, I have shown you all my birth certificate. Tonight I'm going to show you something else. I'm going to show you my birth video. And everybody went, oh. And the lights dimmed, and then behind him on this massive screen, there was the opening sequence of Simba in The Lion King. That is genius. That is political genius, in my view. Diffused it, did it with humour. I'm not taking it that seriously. Yes, he was. He was taking it very seriously. But what I'm trying to say is that the who you are story is constantly at the core of American politics. And it is at the core of British politics too, but journalists have been slow to recognise it and slow to interrogate it. And I think we need to do that more.
Well, come on.
It was the birth video that beat all
the
the
group who were
submission.
here before you came in were thinking of questions, and they clearly lost the bottle to ask them. So
Oh,
can I do it on their behalf?
Yeah, go on.
How do you cope with the stress of your job, of live TV news coverage?
I don't find it very stressful, you know, to be honest.
Do some people?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I find some things quite stressful. I find stressful. I find if I'm doing more than an hour, which I can write in advance, if I'm doing a couple of hours, and people put factual errors, mistakes, misspellings in scripts that I'm expected to read, that I find stressful. If it's just doing my job, I love it. I think it's great fun, but I do think it's a bit like flying a plane. You know, you can tell people, oh, be yourself. You know, what a piece of useless advice that is. Be yourself. No, don't be yourself. You be him. I mean, what is producers always say that. You just have to, like flying a plane. You just have to do a lot of it, I think, and you relax. You want to ask your question?
It was sort of answered, wasn't it?
Huh?
About breaking through the firewall?
Yeah, well, sort of. I would like to... Well, you have been interviewing a lot of influential people, and they're obviously very media trained. So how exactly do you get past that firewall of media training? Do you want to?
Well, I guess they are media trained, but the one, I mean, if you mean, you know, when I've met... Well, let me back up a bit. The easiest interviews I've ever done are with politicians who've done the media training, are too thick to understand they've got to actually make an attempt to answer the question, and have learned, have you ever heard this phrase, the bridge? Anybody ever told you this? Right, this is a top secret media training tip. I say to you, your policies on immigration are terrible, and you don't want to talk about that. So what you say is, well, that's very interesting, but what I'd like to tell you is that because of the economic recovery, which I've been responsible for, you see what I did there? Change the subject. Media trainers call it the bridge. It is so dumb. And you know what? The audiences notice it straight away. So all you need to do is point out, you're not actually answering a question about immigration, you're answering a question about the economy, because that's the one that you like to talk about, or whatever. So if that's what you mean by media training, I'm not sure it's very useful. The really, really difficult interviews are people who actually tell the truth, because you have nowhere else to go. So if I say to Dolly Parton, which bits of you are true or false, she goes, it's all false. What's my next question? Slightly difficult. More interesting example is a number of years ago, I filmed in Alaska and down the Aleutian chain towards Russia, because I discovered that there was what was called then the new maritime strategy. And what it meant was, if there was ever a war in Europe, that the United States was going to invade the Soviet Far East, as it then was. This film, I did a series of films in '89 about this, and cut Russia in half. Now, I did a lot of filming and kept asking the Pentagon for an interview, and they kept saying, no, we don't talk about national security matters. And then at some point, I don't know what it was that I must have done, they agreed to give us an interview with one of the members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And so he was the head of the Marine Corps, General P.X. Kelly. And I spent the weekend before doing that interview game planning with my producer. He would be P.X. Kelly, which was difficult because P.X. Kelly was 6'8", my producer was 5'4". But game planning how we were going to get him to admit that the Americans had plans to destroy the Soviet Union. And so I would say this, and he would say that, and I would say this, and after 3 pages and 2 days of work, we finally got what we thought would be a clip we'd be able to run in our wonderful documentary. We turned up at the Pentagon on the Monday morning. I sat down in front of General P.S. Kelly, ramrod straight, hair shaved off, and I said, General, in the event of a war in Europe, what is American military strategy in the Soviet Far East? He said, son, we're going to invade Russia, we're going to cut it in two, and we're going to kill it. Is there anything more about killing Russia that you'd like to tell me? So, what I'm saying is that for those who've done, he probably did media training. He didn't need media training. For him, or somebody like Angela Merkel or Clinton or Thatcher, actually, the media training is a way to the side. Their ability to engage, their command of the facts, the fact that, as you will soon recognise, they know much more about what they're talking about than you do, unless there's some poor hapless person put up, as occasionally happens in our country, because, say, the Chancellor of the Exchequer can't be bothered to come and defend his own policies. He sends a junior Treasury Minister out who becomes a human sacrifice because he or she hasn't got a bloody clue what they're talking about. So I hope that answers your question.
It does, thank you.
Are these like concerning more investigations?
I have no idea. I don't work for them anymore because they may not be doing any more investigations, among other things. So I don't know.
What's the most enjoyable thing you've done as a journalist?
I don't know. I was I was once in the Upper Amazon filming the burning rainforest, and we were working on motorised canoes, dugout canoes, because that was a way to get around. And we stopped someplace, and for about, I would reckon, slightly less than a second, I saw 2 river dolphins in the Amazon. I went, that was it.
Why?
1 second.
Why does that stick out more than anything else?
Because I was doing stuff about how we're destroying the planet. We'd been threatened with being shot. There were very, very horrible people around. Some of whom looked as if they were from Central Casting in Hollywood. They'd bandoliers of bullets and guns. And suddenly there were these 2 river dolphins who were just doing whatever river dolphins do. It's pretty cool.
I just want to know, what is the most essential or biggest piece of advice you could offer to journalists who are about to sort of walk into the industry?
Right. I think 2 bits of advice. One bit, which is desperately useful, I think, is be persistent. Because you're persistent to get here, I suspect, because you don't really get to anywhere as a journalist unless you're persistent. And you will always be told, no, I was always told I could never be a journalist or a writer, because people always tell you that. And you can, actually. Some people can. And the second bit of advice, which may or may not be quite so useful, is wherever you work, be very thoughtful of the differences between what your organisation wishes to do editorially and what it needs to do in terms of its business. Because that's where you can get seriously caught or compromised, I would say. Yeah.
So what would you say is like the key trait that a journalist should have in order to be successful, or what is something that you learned along the way that enabled you to be as successful as you were?
Well, I don't know. I mean, every journalist I know is hugely different from each other, except for probably these 2 things. One is endless curiosity. I'm extremely nosy. I never know if something's worth looking into until I've looked into it. And I might waste my time, but I still look into it because I can't really help myself. I'd be a curtain twitcher if I wasn't a journalist. And the second is persistence. I really don't, I get put off when people tell me no, but if I really, really, really think that I'm onto something, I tend not to stop. And I think that's true of every journalist I know, and I know some who've had no education beyond 16, no formal education, and I know some who've got doctorates. But they all have those 2 characteristics. I'm not sure whether you can work in those or not. I don't know if you can have them if you don't have them. I don't think those are things you can learn. You can learn a lot of skills, and it is a skill. I do not believe, nobody's raised this, but I think the concept of citizen journalism is a total nonsense. I mean, citizen journalists are witnesses. They're primary sources. They may be very brave people. The people who put up video in Tahrir Square are very brave people. They're not journalists. They're witnesses. And I was talking to another university group in Ireland where a student there was giving me a very hard time. She was saying citizen journalism is great, it's the way forward and so on. And I said to her, well, I tell you what, if you're a citizen journalist, I'm a citizen dentist. Let's have a look at your teeth. I have absolutely no knowledge or skill, but I'm sure I'll have an opinion. So that's pretty much how I think. I think you can learn a lot of skills. I'm not sure you can learn curiosity and just being. The Scottish word is thrawn. I'm very, very thrawn. It means stubborn to the point of perhaps not in your own best interests. I don't recommend it, by the way. Don't try it out.
So you mentioned persistence, but has that persistence ever got you in trouble? Has there been a moment when you've realised I should probably back off here for a story or anything like that?
Yeah, actually in Northern Ireland quite a bit. I mean, I had a great time in Northern Ireland. I love Northern Ireland. I think it's a great place. But there was, well, one occasion that comes to mind. There were a number of IRA funerals, and one was in near Crossmaglen in County Armagh. And the BBC, somebody else on the BBC had broadcast something about the IRA. I can't remember what it was, but it had not gone down well. And there was a blanket ban on the BBC covering this particular funeral, because it would be the usual stuff, people firing over the coffin and so on. And I had an American journalist, a very eminent, lovely American journalist who was in her 60s, called Mary McGrory, who had helped me when I was in Washington. And I said I'd drive her around Northern Ireland because she'd never been there, though she was an Irish American. And she wanted to go to this funeral. So I phoned up the IRA, basically, and said, I'm coming to this funeral. I'm not going to be reporting for the BBC, but I'm taking this journalist, and I just want you to know. And they said, that's fine. But they did say, if anything appears on the BBC that you've done, there were various words used, you'll be in trouble, let's put it that way. So I turned up at the funeral and had to go through various checks because they have, and my face was quite well known in Northern Ireland. And every time I met people from the IRA, I would say, but I talked to this person and it's all fine and I'm not going to be reporting, I'm with this lovely lady, please will you talk to her, she's very interested in finding out what's going on. Everything was absolutely brilliant until the point where they were firing the shots over the coffin. And I could see on a slightly raised piece of ground at the back of the funeral, there was a cameraman called Cyril Cave, who worked for the BBC, who had a bag on his shoulder. And I realised that he was obviously filming with this bag. And not only did I realise it, half the IRA of South Armagh realised it. So they chased after him and he ran away. And I was standing there with Mary McGrory thinking, God, that's a really stupid thing to do. That's really stupid. At which point, one of the group from the South Armagh guys yelled, and there's another one of them. And that was me. So I said to Mary, I'm going to run away now. She wasn't in a running frame of mind. I mean, she was in her 60s. I said, I'll see you back in the car. And I ran like hell. I mean, it was all sorted out afterwards. It was a misunderstanding. But I did think at that point, probably I pushed this one a little bit too far. At the back, I'll just grab some more.
As your job became more international, how much of that was influenced by maybe a desire to travel?
Yeah, I wanted to travel. I wanted to live in America. I thought, when I thought of a medical career, I wanted to go and work in Seattle, in the Pacific Northwest. But that's not a big news place. But I definitely did want to travel. So I've travelled lots of places. I've reported from every continent on Earth except Antarctica, which is good fun. So yeah, definitely.
It's the media's responsibility to tell the truth. But there's a thin line between telling the truth and being sensationalist. That being said, what are your views on regulation? Should we be regulated? And if so, should it be by the government or by an independent body?
Well, there's a number of questions there. I mean, sensational is a value-loaded term. If when President John F. Kennedy was shot, that was sensational news. You didn't have to say very much about it. One of the things that I find kind of ridiculous is you can always tell when a story is a strong story because you don't actually have to write it up. And one of the things that drives me bonkers, to go back to the stress question, is when some of my colleagues, even in the BBC, which I think has got very, very high standards, uses kind of journalese phrases for things. I mean, a brutal murder. I'm glad we say that, because that distinguishes it from all the nice gentle murders that take place all over the world. And there's dozens of cliches like that journalists use. We should just stop using them. I remember my first news editor at the Belfast Telegraph said to me, "You should avoid cliches like the plague." And when I laughed, I think that's why I got the job. That's one of the things. Journalese, sensationalists, if the story's any good, you don't need to talk it up in a ludicrous way. When John F. Kennedy was shot, you didn't have to say, "It's a tragedy. It's the President of the United States who got shot." The words tragedy and all those words almost cease to have much meaning because they're so overused. And what was the other bit?
Do you think that we should be regulated?
Regulated. Well, I find this a very difficult area. It seems to me that my simple answer would be no, broadly. I think there is clearly some terrible things that have happened in the press in the past few years that we found out about. I think they've always happened one way or another, maybe not hacking because we didn't have the technology, but those kind of things. And they're illegal, and people have been punished, and people have gone to jail, and I think that's great. What's interesting is that not a single story that I'm aware of that came about as a result of phone hacking is worth a damn. Can you think of any story that has changed the world as a result of phone hacking? Maybe you can. Anybody? No. It's all celebrity nonsense. That's what phone hacking produced. It did not produce what...
David Lee at The Guardian he said he hacked a phone in order to... It was an arms dealer.
In order to demonstrate that an arms dealer exported from Britain to the Middle East weapons without a end-user license. And he used that as an argument for a public interest defence for hacking. But I wouldn't say it changed the world. I'd say it was a legitimate story. And there are a few occasions on which a good journalist might wish to intercept a telephone call and might wish to have a public interest defence to do it. But it's been very rare, and I think you're right, it's almost always been done to intercept some political data. Because the guys who really want to hide it probably know that their phones are being tapped.
I agree with that. I can think of a few public interest offences, gun running, serious crime, paedophilia, those kind of things. I can understand it. In terms of regulation, I mean, the IPCC is a bit of a joke. I think what disturbs me is, although the press has changed in this, I think, is the lack of ability to get corrections if something is completely wrong. But the problem with all regulation is we're not only shutting the door after the horse is bolted, we're fixing a problem it is still a current problem, but the problem that's present is so much of our sources of information are nonsense. On the internet, in this lecture last week, I pointed out my wife's Wikipedia page refers to her musical career, broadly accurately, and then it says that while at the London School of Economics, she financed her way through university by appearing as a stuntwoman in Bond movies. She didn't. But trying to get that out of Wikipedia, I mean, the number of errors that are current that you can't get rid of and have got nothing to do with regulation. I mean, I think editors are a form of regulation. Not buying the newspaper is another form of regulation. It seems to me it would be good if there was a system whereby newspapers, which generally don't correct things. But those are, they are important issues, but the idea of some big government apparatus does not appeal to me, or government-inspired apparatus doesn't appeal to me.
Has there been a time when your work ethics as a journalist was compromised?
Sadly, no. I've been hoping somebody would bribe me for years, but it hasn't happened. The closest it came was once I was doing a film about car launches, sports car launches into the United States. And there was a new British car that was going to be launched. And I arranged to film with, I think it was Datsun or somebody who'd launched a sports car in the United States. And the idea was I would drive around the corner and say, this was the last big sports car launch for a company in the United States, and it sold 10,000, whatever it was, Porsches or whatever. And it went really well. Now, can Britain match it? That was the idea. So that's what happened. But beforehand, I had to sign this form, which was an insurance disclaimer form. So I thought. I'd do the piece to camera, finish it. It was in Los Angeles. I hand the keys back to the guy who said, but you signed for it for the weekend. I'd apparently signed to have a sports car for the weekend, which I didn't want and didn't need. I should say, I gave it back. But that's as close as it's come. It's really bloody boring.
What sort of a job do you think Tony Hall's doing at BBC?
He's doing a really good job. I think it's a very difficult job. It may even be an impossible job. I think he's broadly doing a good job. I mean, he's having to manage decline. He's having to manage financial decline. And I think it's going to get worse. That's going to get obvious that there are going to be some things that we all care about which are going to have to be lost, probably. And I think that's extremely difficult. To be honest, I'm just glad he took it on, because I admire him personally. I think he's a good guy, and it could have been far worse. You could have had somebody who had no real experience of broadcasting, and he did great work at the Opera House. So I'm hopeful he will do as best anybody can do under incredibly difficult circumstances.
Do you think there are particular bits that need to be protected?
Well, I think from where I stand, BBC News, obviously, is a surprise. I think if I were him, I would put the core around the big information things and the big cultural things, the arts, and I think he's done absolutely right. The one thing I would absolutely shift, as I've suggested, is the next time a TV producer says, I've got this great idea for a remake of Jane Austen, I would say, how about something a bit more Elmore Leonard-like in the 20th century or 21st century? That's what I would do. That's the one big shift I do. I think these are really interesting times, and I think the more, through the fall and other things, the more BBC drama reflects the interesting times we're in, the better. And the less we do, I know it gets the ratings, but guys on horses with swords, I mean.
What about the management stuff at the top? The very wide perception that BBC managers, there were too many of them, and they were all being paid far too much and taking too many taxes.
Well, that's the perception in the BBC itself. I would say, somebody once said to me, how come you manage to write so many books while working at the BBC? And I say the answer is I don't go to meetings. I'm just not part of that culture if I can avoid it. I go to editorial meetings, but I don't go to management meetings. Thank God.
You didn't answer the question.
Well, no, I did. Everybody agrees with that, I think, the premise of your question.
That's still a problem.
Yeah, sure.
There's too many managers being paid too much.
Sure. Yeah, good. Yeah, Tim.
Can I ask you about political interviewing, because you've done more of it? I take the media training point, I agree with you, it's not a hugely significant factor. Do you think, though, that the modern generation of British politicians in particular, who have tended to come from backgrounds in professional politics and who lack the experience of external professions, perhaps lack the confidence and the hinterlands to engage in the way the previous generation did?
Absolutely. I think this is, to go back to the trust question I raised before. One of the reasons we don't trust politicians in general is they all seem the same. And one of the reasons why Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage and Alex Salmond in Scotland stand out is they seem different. And when I said to you, politician. I mean, I know I respect quite a few politicians. I won't tell you who they are because it will blight their careers. But they do quite a difficult job. And they hate being told they're all the same. But I urge you to look, not at the Eton thing. Forget the Eton thing. I think that's a blind alley. Look at PPE at Oxford. Look at how many of our top politicians and some of our top journalists have done one degree course at one university. It is hardly surprising that we suffer in this country from a kind of operational groupthink at the top, because they aren't all the same. Not all, but they have had very, very similar upbringings. They are much younger when they, Clegg and Miliband and so on were in their 40s. If you look in British history at when people became Prime Minister or thought they had got a shot at it, they were much older. They had done other things. The post-war generation, in particular, who came to power or prominence in the 60s and 70s is very interesting, because when they said we are all in this together, they meant it, because they had been. So you had Heath, who was in the army, Callaghan, who was in the navy, you had Enoch Powell, who had been a brigadier general, gone up from being a private soldier. This is not to defend their policies or their statements. This is their who am I story. And their who am I stories are a heck of a lot more interesting than the politicians that we have today. And there's a few exceptions. David Davis, who's one of those who said that David Cameron, he shouldn't have so many old Etonians around him. John Major, who was used very strongly in the Conservative campaign a few years ago, when I forget exactly what it said, but it's something like, what does the Conservative Party promise a young lad from Brixton? It made him Prime Minister. Mrs. Thatcher, the grocer's daughter from Grantham. Whereas now we have, when people talk about the political elite, everybody knows what they mean. And so therefore you do not get, there are a lot of bright people in politics, a lot of able people in politics, but they haven't done other things. And partly, and this could be where we come in the media, when I've been talking about leadership and leadership stories from lessons from the top from the book to business groups, I get a lot of invitations to go and talk to business groups. I always ask them, hands up all of you who are politically involved. I mean, have you ever run for political office? And there's usually laughter. Do you vote? Yeah, most of them vote. But have you ever considered joining a political party? A joke. There are, leaving out the Scottish National Party, there are probably only about 350,000 people in the United Kingdom who are members of the top three big political parties. 350,000 people. There are more millionaires in Britain than there are people in political parties. We have become totally disengaged from this particular class. And to go back to Tim's question, many of us think of them almost like East German athletes at the end of the Cold War, as if they've trained from the age of 3 or 4 for a political career, which is separate from the rest of us. And it shows. And I think it's very, very unfortunate, because we need people with experience to go into politics, and they don't.
So what do you do about that? How do you help them do that? How do you achieve that?
Well, there's a number of things you could do. Personally, I would double their pay and half their numbers. I would make it clear that the who am I story is really going to be rigorously interrogated. And if you are a 30-year-old political candidate who gets a safe seat, we are going to ask, as journalists, what have you done except work for the Labour Party or the Conservative Party for the last 10 years? What have you actually done? I think I am not suggesting that we interrogate the who am I story about who do you sleep with and what your sexual preferences are and all that kind of stuff which fills the tabloids. I am suggesting there's a serious journalistic role for interrogating who are these people who wish to rule over us. Who are they? What have they ever done that inspires confidence in you and me that we would let them run a ministry? There are quite a few of them who, as we know, couldn't run the inevitable drink up in a brewery.
Just curious, going back to these stories. You told us your first story. What would the two other stories sound like?
What were two other stories?
The two other stories.
Oh, who are we?
And
I think we...
us being journalism students and you being a journalist.
Oh, I see, okay. Because I think who are we is very fungible. It's different in different cases. And in fact, one of the interesting things about how the United Kingdom won the Olympics was the people behind it, and I go into this in great detail in the book, were very careful about what the who are we story is. They were telling to the International Olympic Committee, so we got the Olympics. So France told them, we are the city of lovers. Madrid had a flamenco dancer. Russia had a bear. And London told a story about we're multicultural, multiracial, and we're really interested in getting kids who might get into trouble to do sport. So the who are we story is really important. Who are we as journalists? Well, we're not loved. We're quite often respected. We're sometimes feared. We get a bad press. We get a bad press because of some of the worst that some people do. And I can feel for politicians in that. You know, they weren't all on the take. The expenses scandal of a few years ago touched a few really badly. But actually, do you know what? Charging for biscuits and a bit of parking is just the sort of, it was a bit witch hunty, to be honest. And I think we are people who, broadly, would like to try and get at the truth. Broadly. I think that's what we try to do. And sometimes we occasionally manage it. With very little help, often from the people that we're reporting on. Does that answer?
It is.
Good.
In terms of change that's been made to the wider world, what do you think has been your most valuable interview?
Most valuable interview? I don't know the answer to that. I think I've got people out of prison who shouldn't have been in prison. One was the Irish guy I talked about, and that was a seminal event because this was the Guildford bombers, and they were all fitted up. It's disgraceful. And the key thing was we went for the weakest part of the Crown case because the evidence was all common. So once I got that, they all fell apart. More recently, I did a thing for Radio 4 on a guy called Samuel Hajj, who was held in Guantanamo Bay, who shouldn't have been held there, who was a fellow journalist. And I'm pleased to say he was released within 6 months of the report. So I'm not saying it changed the world, but it changed the world for these two people and their families, and I'm very proud of that. I think that's what journalism can do, because we can alert people to injustice.
Going back to politics for a second, and one of these people who have a different story to tell is Mr. Farage and his pint and laugh in a pub. And I think what we've been hearing a lot in the media is how UKIP is going to change the elections come next May. You've seen elections here and in the US. Are British politics really going to change next May?
I think they are actually, but I suspect my gut well, David Aronovich, who's a friend of mine, the Times columnist, I asked him to tell me, just to save all me reading the papers for the next 6 months, who's going to win the election? And he said, I would have to sacrifice a goat and look at its entrails to even have a clue who's going to win the next election. Which, given that he is quite an admirable columnist, I suspect most of us agree. My gut feeling, is that the SNP in Scotland are going to be a bigger story than UKIP. I think the Labour Party is in real trouble in Scotland. We'll see how today's announcement of new powers goes down. But what happened, to go back to part of the earlier conversation, what happened in Scotland was people became engaged in politics. They went to public meetings. You couldn't get away from people talking about it. Everywhere, in the pub, on the train. On the day of the vote, the SNP had 26,000 members. It's now got about 90,000 members in 2 months. So they have got more members than Lib Dems, and my guess is they will have more active members by Christmas than the Conservative Party. I guess. Could be wrong, but that's what I'm thinking. In a country of a population of 5 million. So I suspect they could win half the seats in Scotland. So you could have a patchwork quilt with nobody really winning the election. We could have 2 elections within a year. So if I had to bet on something, it would be that. It'd be political instability, but with UKIP having, my guess is, some seats, but not very many compared to that. Plus, of course, we have the Democratic Unionist Party and Sinn Féin. So it's going to be very interesting, I think.
What has been your most difficult story to cover in terms of it challenging you as a journalist, and why is that?
I don't know really. I try to avoid those. Difficult. I'm not sure really. I mean, I covered a lot of stories in Latin America, which were quite tricky for various reasons, because there was a lot of violence. The most difficult interview I've ever had to do was with a Hollywood star who was a complete pain in the neck. So it doesn't really fit in. I can't really think of one. I mean, this is a personal preference. I tend not to do stories about people being rotten to children, because I don't like them, and I don't need them very much, to be honest. I've got 4 children, and I find those very harrowing, so I would tend to avoid those. So maybe I'll challenge myself by not doing them.
Are we in danger of destroying your voice, preventing for another week?
Yeah, the BBC might be very grateful, but
actually that Hollywood star was, like, we're not going to get away with that.
All right, if I do that, maybe I should wind up at that point. All right. It was Catherine Deneuve, who was a real disappointment to me for various reasons, because ever since I was a 14-year-old, I saw Belle de Jour, I thought she was lovely. And we'd arranged, I was doing a series of interviews with people for half an hour, including Dolly Parton actually, who was wonderful. And Deneuve messed us around endlessly. I had 2 crews, and she kept changing the time, the location, so on, over several days, which costs a fortune. And eventually, and she'd agreed to do the interview. I mean, I kept saying, well, does she want to do the interview or not? If she doesn't, I'm quite happy, but no, she's really keen to do the interview. So finally, I ended up phoning her hotel room directly. I said I was downstairs, I was setting up. If you're not down in 20 minutes, we're leaving, and that's it. So she came down, but she was in a strop. So during the course of this interview, when I'm talking to one of the great French screen actresses of all time, I'm saying things, she'd go, no, I don't think so. No, perhaps not, I don't think so. This went on for about 15 minutes until finally I had it, and I thought, right, there's 2 things I can do now. I can lose it, or I can try egregious flattery. I'll go flattery first. So I said, there's one reviewer who said you're the greatest cool blonde in cinema history. It's not true. That's when I lost it. I said, so you're not the greatest, you're not cool, or you're not really a blonde? Oh. That was a mistake. I can't remember what happened next. Actually, I can, but I'm not going to say.